All right, we are now recording
All right.
and we should be live on Facebook momentarily. It's 11:58, so we'll give it people a few minutes to file in for our clean water conversation. This is our third one we've done. We've got Michael Grunwald here today, author of The Swamp. We're excited to talk to you all. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director of Friends of the Everglades, and we've got a ton to talk about. Welcome everybody. Post any questions you have for Michael in the chat. We'll be popping into those later. But first, I want to introduce Michael properly. Mike is a senior staff writer at Politico magazine, author of multiple books, and the one we're here to talk about today is The Swamp, The Everglades, Florida, and the Politics of Paradise, published in 2006. But as I've been rereading it this week, have been struck by how much it holds up and yet how much has transpired in the 14 years since. So we have a ton to get caught up on, and thanks for being here today, Michael. We really appreciate it, especially in these pandemic circumstances when we're all doing these virtual meetings.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. It's an honor, and I'm a huge fan of your work, as you know.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So well wishes to our audience on Facebook Live too, and we'll also be posting this on YouTube. We appreciate your attention to environmental issues, even as we are all so preoccupied with really important world events. But this issue, the environment, the Everglades in particular, remains critically important too. So we want to dive into some topics in that regard. And it's very timely because there's a massive algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee right now. And it's kind of like a bullet loaded in the chamber as I sit and steward on the St. Lucie estuary side of things. And the Caloosahatchee folks feel the same way, I know. So a lot of these system problems that you articulated so well in The Swamp still exist. So before we get into all of that, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about why you wrote about the Everglades. I mean, you really told a remarkable tale of an ecosystem. I think you started before Florida was even a peninsula. I mean, continental drift. And then you got into it as a battlefield, as a site of plunder, and some plunder is still going on, arguably, and then as a modern day political prop. So why did you spend all this time on the Everglades?
Oh, it's a good question. Sometimes I still ask myself that. I was a, believe it or not, young reporter at the Washington Post back a million years ago. And I got obsessed with the Army Corps of Engineers and essentially how they were running around the country doing these preposterous boondoggles that just as a byproduct were environmentally destructive as well as economically ridiculous. I found out while I was working on it that the Army Corps had sort of helped ravage the Everglades and now is in charge of the largest environmental project in history to try to fix the Everglades. And that sounded like a cool kind of good news story that I would use as the end of the series. So I came down for the first time in August 2000, almost exactly 20 years ago, which as you and presumably everybody watching knows, August is not the best time to visit the Everglades. And like many people who visit the Everglades for the first time in the sweltering heat and mosquitoes, I was kind of like, really? They want to save this place? But I eventually kind of figured out why it was important and realized that it wasn't just this pure good news story about the Army Corps riding to the rescue. Ended up doing an entire series just about Everglades restoration, some of the promises and some of the problems, and decided to do a book that I thought was going to be about Everglades restoration, and actually was sort of researching what I thought would be essentially the introduction, the early just segue into how we got here. And I realized that the story of how we got here is really the story. That this is the best place to tell the story of man and nature, our kind of abusive relationship with our environment and our sort of belated efforts to make amends. So I kind of got obsessed. I moved down here to write the book. I met a Florida girl, so I ended up staying here. I'm now part of our population problem. So are my two kids, and I guess the rest is literally history.
That's interesting. And it reminds me of our founder, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas at Friends of the Everglades, experience with the Everglades itself in a way. She, of course, wrote River of Grass in 1947, which I know you're very familiar with. And she didn't like to spend a ton of time out in the Everglades because it was so buggy and unpleasant at certain times of the year. She preferred her scotch on her back porch, I think. So you have that in common. I don't know about the scotch.
Yeah, look, I always admit, I'm not really a nature guy. Before that, I wasn't even an environmental reporter. My idea of the outdoors is playing tennis. But I was fortunate to spend, when you write about a topic like the Everglades, you really have to learn it inside and out. You have to see it through the eyes of the people who do love it and do understand it. And so I do hope that I do now have some appreciation for this, very cool place. And we do visit.
Sure, that makes sense. You're a newcomer to Florida. I'm a native, but Florida has 21
Not
million
new anymore, Eve.
people. Yeah, yeah, okay. You're an old timer now.
That counts as an old timer for us.
So 21 million people here. I think there are what, 8 when you wrote The Swamp, 8 million or so.
And more than that, but yeah.
Okay, huge population boom, and the state itself feels like 5 states in some ways, and we don't have this collective experience. But I would argue that the Everglades might be an exception to that. Even if you're in the Panhandle or North Florida, you know of it, there's an identity that resonates. So for that reason, it certainly is a great subject to study and for us to advocate for preservation of. So, all right, so I want to jump in to all that has happened since 2006 when the book published. And as I was compiling this list, which I promise I will go through very quickly, I felt like
hear this.
it was like flashes of We Didn't Start the Fire, Billy Joel's video. I felt like I was in that video. So yeah, we could probably do a riff on this later. So since 2006, Charlie Crist's U.S. sugar deal. He was going to buy a huge swath of U.S. sugar land. And then the subsequent unraveling of Charlie Crist's U.S. sugar deal, followed by the environmentally disastrous tenure of Rick Scott, restoration strategy settlement that resulted from a lawsuit and sent $880 million in taxpayer money to the Everglades. Scott took credit for it, a little dubious if he could, followed by major toxic algae blooms on both coasts and protests. Senate Bill 10 in the Florida legislature, which partially resulted from those protests and called for a new EAA reservoir south of the lake. Then fast forward, I'm skipping a lot here. DeSantis gets elected, partially on a wave of this outrage due to our water issues. And he went on the offensive against Big Sugar, which was unusual. DeSantis cleans house at the South Florida Water Management District, which is the state's lead agency on Everglades restoration. He makes a lot of environmental promises. The Florida legislature does not really follow through during the session, this most recent session. That's not a big surprise. And at the same time, not one of the 68 projects in SERP, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which is the focus of the swamp, or partially the focus, has been completed. So we're getting perhaps within 5 years on some, within a few years maybe. But there's a lot that hasn't happened too, but I don't want to dive into that. So with all of that in mind, and we could go into more detail, but I won't. You wrote in the book that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas said in 1947 that the Everglades was at the 11th hour then. So where do you think we are now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's late. But, and I don't, shouldn't say this in front of friends of the Everglades, but, the Everglades is always dying, right? I mean, it's always late. It's always the 11th hour. And honestly, a lot of bad policy has happened because of people saying like, the Everglades is dying. We need to act now. The Everglades is in terrible shape. I mean, you didn't even mention the fact that pythons are eating everything, right?
There's that.
Which is sort of like, we could have they could have done all 68 of those SERP components, and we'd have a completely done Everglades restoration, and the pythons would still be ruining everything. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's I'm allowed to use that word in this venue. It's bad. It's we're Marjorie used to always say that the Everglades is a test. If we pass, we may get to keep the planet, and there is nothing that is happening. Or at least there is very little that is happening that suggests that we're going to be able to keep the planet. I hope we're going to. Meanwhile, the seas are rising, and the Everglades, could go underwater. There has not been a lot of good news. That said, the Everglades is pretty resilient. So it is. It can't recover if you pave it over. And half of it is paved, and that's not coming back. But the rest of it, we haven't been fixing it, but we could. It could still be fixed. And I always like to point out, we have this incredible commitment from the federal government, the state government, right wingers, left wingers, buffalo wingers, right? Everybody says they want to save the Everglades, and we've got this massive governmental vow to do it. So we ought to, but it's true. Over the last 14 years, we haven't.
Yeah, I hear you. And I do think the Everglades and nature itself is resilient. We got a break from pollution in the St. Lucie River the last 2 years, partially because of better lake management by the Army Corps, and seagrass grew back. The waters were clear for a while. So it can happen, and I have to be optimistic in the line of work I'm in, and I definitely appreciate your context. I mean, it's like a never-ending battle in some ways, but we celebrate victories along the way, and hope that the change we're creating creates more good than harm.
Well, Marjorie used to say, I think that nature is like an old tire, right? It's like it's tough, and you look at what's happened in the Kissimmee River. Where I always tell the story of my first time visiting it. And as you know, the Army Corps turned the Kissimmee, which was naturally this magnificent serpentine, crazy river that sort of twisted through that floodplain like a drunken unicyclist, I think I said in the book. And they turned it into a ditch. Then people said, hey, this is bad. Marjorie was one of the people who said it, we should try to make it a river again. And the Army Corps sort of was dragged into this kicking and screaming, and finally said, like, okay, we'll engineer you a river. And people, the scientists were sort of like, no, thank you. Why don't you just unengineer the ditch? And I still remember I went for the first time I saw, it was, I think my first time in Florida was in 2000. I went with one of the scientists working on it, and he cut off the engine on his airboat, made this grand gesture and said, look, as far as the eye can see, this all used to be this bone dry cattle pasture, and look at it now. And, I'm looking around, we're in this kind of scraggly little marsh. It's, the water's up to our ankles. It's, I guess, a broadleaf marsh. And it's not Yellowstone National Park. And I remember I said to him, I was like, wow, if it's like this after a year, what's it going to look like in 10 years? He's like this. We're done. You get out of Mother Nature's way, it comes back. And obviously, like, we're not, we have 10 million people living in South Florida, and we're not just going to get out of the way like we could in the Kissimmee Valley. But it is true. I'm not optimistic by nature, but about this stuff, it's like, one way to get out of the hole is to stop digging.
Right.
And if we stop hitting ourselves on the head with a hammer, maybe it won't hurt so much.
Words of wisdom. So we talked about what has happened since the swamp. I also want to touch on what has not happened. So we haven't changed the fact that the Everglades are still too dry during the dry season, and that is perhaps the essence of Everglades restoration, fixing that problem. Florida Bay, south of the Everglades in the Keys, still suffers from hypersalinity and has had bad seagrass die-offs. The northern estuaries, as we've talked about, struggle with blue-green algae blooms stemming from Lake Okeechobee algae blooms. Red tide on the West Coast has been a problem, which can be fueled by nutrients coming from discharges. Also, the amount of phosphorus entering the lake is still massive, and the South Florida Water Management District, is moving toward these, Kissimmee River full restoration, and that's a federal project. C-44 canal, C-43 canal and reservoir. The Herbert Hoover Dike is being repaired around the lake. So, those things are happening, but what hasn't happened are tangible results yet. So we're hearing from state officials that we're going to see them within the next 5 years. So I think the proof is out, and then the jury is out. But meanwhile, the biggest thing politically that hasn't changed is that Big Sugar still carries immense weight in Tallahassee and on these issues. And I mean, you're an excellent student of politics, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And then one last thing, and I'm going to turn it to you. We've talked about something that you didn't get into in the book, a topic that really looms large in terms of the future of the Everglades, and that's climate change. So tell me why you didn't jump in then and where your head's at now.
Oh boy. So those are a bunch of different things. Let me first do the like a little bit of 10,000 feet about where we're at and what hasn't been done. And I think we've said, and I've offered, I will come back and talk to you guys in more detail about sort of restoration and where things stand. But the quick, easy way of thinking of it is that the basic point of Everglades restoration is that we have a problem that was created by the hurricane of 1928. In 1928, as people may remember, you had a lot of people, if you read Their Eyes Are Watching God, right? The Monstropolis beast has left its bed. A hurricane came and blasted Lake Okeechobee through its dike. And after that, people said, well, we got to do something, that we got to fix that. And the sort of basically what we've done over the last, or at least over the next 60 years, was we throttled the Everglades so that it would never do that again. The big Hoover Dike around the lake, 2,000 miles of levees and canals, powered by new, the pumps. They were just so powerful. They needed to cannibalize the engines from nuclear submarines to run them. I mean, basically, we've made sure that every drop of water that lands in South Florida gets whisked off to sea, so it doesn't,
right,
in our backyard.
And not just for the safety of people south of the lake, but for development, of course.
Right. That's that we can have, that's how we can have 10 million people down here. That's how we can have the Sawgrass and Palmetto expressways where the Sawgrass and Palmettos used to be. That's how we can have a sugar industry in the Northern Everglades. We have all these subdivisions named after the trees and animals that used to be there. That's how we can have this awesome megalopolis that you and I enjoy. The problem is it destroyed the Everglades. That was sort of the downside.
Right.
And Everglades restoration is supposed to basically get back that water that used to flow from the lake down in this giant sheet through all the way down to Florida Bay and the 10,000 islands. And the way to do that, if you had to, again, I know I'm wildly oversimplifying. As you said, there are 68 components to it. If you add up all the technical documents, you probably got 100,000 pages of planning on this thing. But basically, it's a water project. It's a storage project. The idea is to build water storage so that we don't have to dump it on the estuary during the wet season, and you don't get your guacamole glop in your backyard and red tides and all this nastiness coming from blasting water out of Lake Okeechobee, so that we don't have another 1928 hurricane situation. And in the dry season, we'll have some water.
Yeah,
So
complicated by the fact.
Not just for the sugar industry and for the 8 million of us who live here, but for the Everglades too. And that's the plan. And 20 years later, we haven't built any storage. So that's the basic problem. So, I remember quoting somebody when I did that original story in 2000. I quoted a lobbyist for the Everglades National Park, which it's even weird that they have, I guess you would say she's in intergovernmental relations. But she said her fear was that if in 10 years, they can't point to tangible environmental progress, she's afraid that the senators who voted from North Dakota and Montana and Iowa are going to say, what are we doing with our money?
Right.
And I think 20 years later, with very few environmental benefits to point to, that's still a pretty legitimate fear.
Yeah. And I'll add, you're spot on with the water storage. And then an additional complicating factor is that if we want to move water south, it has to be cleaned. So water treatment is such a huge component. And we'll talk a little bit later about the EAA reservoir, which does have decent storage, but perhaps inadequate treatment. So, and I know I threw a lot at you before. We're going to hold off on Big Sugar and its influence. We'll come back to that. So let's talk about climate change, because I'm really struck by something you told me a few days ago. You said you wished you had included more about climate change in the swamp.
Yeah, I mean, I'm proud of the swamp, and I'm glad. I think it's, you know, I think it's had a good impact on, you know, on the state. I hope. Certainly, you know, I hope people have enjoyed it. But when it came to climate, I kind of blew it. You know, I wrote about, you know, I wrote 400 pages about a, you know, ecosystem the size of Connecticut. That's, you know, most of it is, you know, has signs in it that say things like Rock Reef Pass, elevation 3 feet. And I didn't write about the fact that the seas are rising. You know, I had a couple lines in it. At one point, I remember right the day Bill Clinton signed his Everglades Restoration into law, which is the opening scene of the book. At one point that day, he's alone with an aide to Connie Mack, who is the Republican senator, and Bob Graham, who is the Democratic senator. And he's just sort of riffing, and he goes, you know, we don't do something about global warming, your Everglades is going to be underwater. Which was true. But yeah, no, I think it's a huge deal. And on the flip side, it turns out, you know, almost through happenstance, that the best thing you can do to help the resilience of the Everglades to sea level rise is to restore that sheet flow of water. You know, it's sort of like restoring the Mississippi River to build up that delta, you know, and to build up the muck at its mouth. That's kind of what, you know, that's kind of what it's doing. And certainly if we could do that, we'll see less saltwater intrusion and less of the other problems as the Everglades starts to migrate north. But yeah, I mean, you know, the climate has, you know, I sort of stumbled into the environment through the Everglades, and now I'm writing a book about climate change, where actually the Everglades will play a little bit of a role in it, because it turns out that one of the best things you can do to reduce carbon is to rehydrate wetlands, drained wetlands. You know, they store a lot of carbon. So yeah, I think you know, it's, you know, the fate of the Everglades and the fate of the climate are really intertwined. And I think that in the same way I wrote about the Everglades as this kind of big honking public policy problem that's going to require sort of serious thinking and more than rhetoric to deal with, climate is like that. It's one of those things that, you know, it's not an instant gratification type project where you know, where politicians get to feel good about themselves when they cut a ribbon. You know, restoring the Everglades, that, you know, there's no handshake at, you know, on the battleship, you know, or, you know, formal surrender, like, you know, just like there won't be for climate change. But you still got to do it. And so yeah, it's certainly, it's a, you know, to the extent that if anybody has criticized the swamp for not putting in enough about climate change, you can know that I agree with your criticism.
Does your new book have a title and a publication date yet?
It'll probably come out in 2022. The working title is Eating the Earth. So.
Interesting. I like it.
A lot about food and land,
yeah,
and climate and agriculture. So, which is you know, which is something that I've again also first started thinking about at all when I started thinking about the Everglades.
Yeah, it gets back to that. The Everglades is a test quote that I've seen many versions of. I mean, it really does feel like a litmus test for so many issues we're grappling with on the planet. And, you know, we can only hope that we pass. So we anticipated our first Facebook question. It was, how will sea level rise impact the Everglades? So I think we touched on that sufficiently, and looking forward to seeing more in your book in terms of what you explore there. I'll remind our audience that if you have questions for Mike, please pop them into the chat. So I want to expand on the sea level rise topic, zoom out a little bit, because there's definitely a theme in the book about nature versus people. And especially in relation to SERP, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, and whether it would favor nature over people. And as I was rereading your book and saw that phrase throughout, it really made me wonder if it is a true conflict. I mean, by favoring nature, aren't we favoring people? And especially in relation to climate change. I wonder how you see that. And I certainly understand why it was framed that way in the book, but how do you view that now?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think certainly one of the things that we've learned, and I think a lot of times people becomes a sort of stand-in for the economy, right? And I do think one of the things we've learned is that you're not going to have an economy in South Florida if we don't save the Everglades. Not only because of and certainly our ecosystem, not only because of the tourism and the bird watching and the scuba diving and all the other reasons that people love what makes South Florida in terms of its natural resources and beauty, but just quite literally our drinking water sits right underneath the Everglades, and that's the constraint on growth in South Florida. So if you want to ruin the Everglades and ruin the drinking water, that's fine, but that's the end of the development industry. And the development industry and the agriculture industry, are along with the tourism industry, are basically our industries. We haven't developed much of anything else. So look, I think I don't want to downplay the notion that the Everglades is important for people. Like, we appreciate it. I'm not one of those people who think that we should put a rope around it and not let anybody in. I want people to enjoy it and experience it and love it and appreciate it. But there's what you hear a lot because of what I mentioned about the drinking water and about and it's also true that the things that are kind of destroying our quality of life in South Florida that people complain about, right? The endless traffic and the overcrowded schools or hospitals or whatever. A lot of it is created by these same kind of sprawl issues that are kind of paving over the Everglades. But so what you hear again and again is that, that in South Florida, the environment is the economy. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of true, but I try to only emphasize it in one direction. It's sort of like, if you save the environment, you save the economy. That there's definitely some truth to that. But people have used that to kind of justify, we can do whatever we want for the economy because the environment is the economy. And mm-hmm. and I want to push back a little bit against the idea that there aren't choices to make, and that there aren't trade-offs, and that there aren't sacrifices. Because one of the problems with Everglades restoration that I wrote about in the book is that there was this sort of fantasy, I think, that we could restore the Everglades without goring anybody's ox, that that nobody, it's written into the law, nobody can lose their existing level of flood control, right?
Or water supply.
Or their existing letter. And in fact, there has to be enough water to double the population without anybody losing their per capita, their water supply. So it's like, we're asking the Army Corps to paint this masterpiece. They're not Picasso, and we're shrinking the canvas every day and basically saying you can't use red, you can't use blue. So we're putting in a lot of constraints. Ultimately, I think we're going to run up into some choices. I am not one of the people who think that the choice is a question of population. I think that's kind of a silly way of thinking of it. Like we should just put up a big, I guess a border wall right on I-95 and not let anybody come down here. It's like, look, this place is awesome. It's paradise. The idea of paradise is that we love it. It's not that we want to pull up the rope ladder now that we're in the treehouse. We just have to figure out how we can all live here sustainably. Because it's cool. It's like, I've contributed to our overpopulation, by moving here, marrying a Florida girl, and we've overpopulated twice. We're not sorry.
Right.
I feel everybody should do that, and we just have to figure out how to deal with it. And sometimes that's going to that might involve not being able to water your lawn 4 times a week.
Sure, absolutely. There are trade-offs, and also just making smarter decisions about the growth. One of the things we've been working on recently is this 836 toll road extension that would go through Bird Drive Basin, which is a SERP in the SERP footprint. And luckily, a judge saw it our way. We supported that case, which was led by Tropical Audubon. But, we've got to make smarter decisions about roads. I think it was going to cut commute times by like 5 minutes. So it's
yeah,
really,
they say, except that every highway ever built ends up increasing traffic, and especially down here where those are just development inducers. And but again, this comes down to leadership. Not to pick on our county mayor, but I'll pick on our county mayor a little bit. There was a hearing that basically the mayor stacked full of reporters, full of supporters of that road, but somehow somebody who opposed it got onto the list, and she got up at that meeting and said, like, hey, you realize this concept of induced development, when you build a road, that more people, you promote sprawl and you end up increasing traffic. And it was obvious that the mayor had never even, who is the mayor of a large metropolitan area in 2020, had never heard of this concept before. It had never even occurred to him. He's like, wait, you're saying that if we build this road, we're going to have more traffic? That's like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so it just shows you, politics matters, and leadership matters, and that's ultimately what we're talking about when we're talking about the bugs and the bunnies.
Yeah, I take your point that there are decisions to be made and there are trade-offs, but I would hope that the do no harm philosophy would apply to at least people of good intention. So in that vein, I want to talk a little bit about toxic algae. Mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that there's a massive bloom on Lake Okeechobee right now. It really feels threatening to us on the estuary side of things. It's terrible for Lake Okeechobee itself. And we know so much more now than in 2006 when you published the book about the human health impacts. So that stuff causes liver disease, it causes ALS, it's linked to other neurodegenerative diseases. So we would like the Army Corps of Engineers and other policymakers not to dump that.
It's not so good for testicles.
Right. Yeah. It's got a myriad of problems, I would say. So I would just, as the Army Corps is reworking its lake management plan, I would hope that that's top of mind for them to do no harm. And we do see some progress, I think, in terms of the Army Corps' attitude. In the swamp, you really characterize their just rigid position very well, but they have become slightly more flexible in recent years and have adjusted lake operations so they're not blasting the estuaries out when there's algae. So that's somewhat hopeful.
Well, again, and as you know, I feel your pain on these blasts out to the estuaries, but I guess to sort of defend the Army Corps, which is not usually what I do. But they've got a problem, right? They've got 10 pounds of crap in a 5-pound bag. And somebody's gonna lose, when there's too much water and no place to put it, it's gonna get dumped somewhere. And I certainly understand why Stewart doesn't want it. And I understand why Fort Myers doesn't want it. And I understand why Everglades National Park doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. And I understand why people don't want it to just sit in the lake and get super high and create a 1928 disaster now that we have 8 million people living behind it. Mm-hmm. There are lots of good reasons not to put the water anywhere, which basically goes back to why we need to fix this frickin' system, because right. so that there's some place to put it that doesn't, turn your backyard into Stankville.
Right. Yeah. We've been looking at solutions that don't require hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of taxpayer money to at least alleviate some of the problems. So managing the Lake Okeechobee lower in the dry season can be helpful in that regard, because then it's not as high in the wet season and you may not have to make discharges. Well, of course, large water users don't like that because the lake is their reservoir. So if you will,
Any large water users you think
I would
of
say
in particular?
sugar, and I'm gonna pull up my dog-eared copy of The Swamp and read a passage here. This is from 2000, the day Clinton celebrated SERP's signing. So he was in the White House, and the Supreme Court was about to
Bob
choose.
Coker, if you're listening, I don't remember writing this, whatever it is.
Yep, it's all in the book, page 353. So at that time, a consultant for the sugar industry demanded to see the district's engineers, warning that they will never stand for zero water supply releases. And I skipped the part here where Lake Okeechobee was so low that the Water Management District's guidelines prohibited releases for irrigation, but the sugar industry demanded to see them. So lo and behold, that winter, the lake plunged below 9 feet for the first time in recorded history. A third of the lake disappeared, along with most of its bass, and the region was battered so badly by Governor Bush that Governor Bush declared an economic state of emergency. But this is the kicker: the sugar industry enjoyed its fourth largest harvest ever. So even as other users suffer, the sugar industry and other large water users don't. And that's really what we're trying to change in this new Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule the Army Corps is working on. And the industry is trying to apply this savings clause, which guarantees water supply, to that process. So it's a struggle. I mean, do you want to comment on that, Mike?
Well, look, I mean, there's supposed to be shared adversity, and I guess some of us end up sharing it more than others. And certainly I've written about, every time there's an issue, the sugar industry brings 77 lobbyists up to Tallahassee, and they get their way, and it's bipartisan, and they're extremely powerful, and nobody wants to fight them. And I'm not sure what to tell you except that it's hard. And if it was easy to beat them, somebody would have beaten them a long time ago. Charlie Crist tried to buy them out, and that was a way of changing the political economy as well as the natural system up there. But then they changed their mind, and now they're printing money again. So it's very difficult to beat them. Generally, the best way to get things done in the Everglades has been by buying off the powerful interests, not by trying to force them to do this or that. Forcing them to do this or that generally requires a lawsuit. And once, as water quality is shown, when you win a lawsuit, then they are very good about doing this and that. The sugar industry is, you'll know better than me, but they've certainly, their water is way cleaner than it was, when that lawsuit was filed in 1989. And that's something I think people should feel proud about, including the sugar industry, even though they had to be sued about it. Look, in ecosystem restoration that depends on, the unconditional surrender of the sugar industry is going to be very difficult. And they are right in the middle of the Everglades. That's the basic problem with the sugar industry. It's not that their runoff is incredibly toxic, or that they're dumping horrible chemicals on us. No, it's just that they're in the middle, they're in the northern Everglades, and they like to be wet when the Everglades like to be dry, and they like to be dry when the Everglades likes to be wet. So, to the extent that they're a large water user, they're going to be an inconvenient water user. And so I think, Everglades Restoration is going to have to kind of work around them and come to an accommodation where something, there's going to have to be some water stored there, and they're going to have to be paid, I'm sure way more, they're going to get way more than they deserve for that, but, you're going to have to do what you got to do. And then there are some things where, restoration won't be perfect because they're in the way. And, you probably will not have that beautiful sheet flow going right from, Lake Okeechobee down to the bay ever again, or at least during our lifetimes. And we have to come up with something, the next best solutions.
Right. I mean, the sheet flow, I think, is out of the question. We had envisioned, and I say we, I mean, all levels of government and SERP, a larger storage area south of the lake, an EAA reservoir, that would then clean and send water south. So we did get a reservoir. It's about 16,000 and change, with the STA, and it'll accommodate about 2/3 of what SERP envisioned. And as you wrote so eloquently, SERP was already watered down through many, many levels of compromise. So we're stuck with 2/3 of the water capacity, and just a big question about whether the treatment marshes will be able to treat the water in this EAA reservoir. And it's going to be 23 feet deep, and nobody's built anything like that in Florida before. The C-43 reservoir connecting to the Caloosahatchee will be about that, but it's under construction. It's not.
It's going to be like that'll be like the tallest spot in South Florida, I guess, except for Mount Trashmore.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a real question mark. What does that mean? Could that make the water dirtier? And how can we make sure that clean water is sent south?
Right. And then there's the question of how much. Look, and this is the sort of thing that people aren't supposed to mention in polite company, but clearly what the Army Corps or a lot of these guys are sort of ultimately trying to get at is they think the lake should be a bigger reservoir. They'd like to store more water in the lake, and there's certainly an opportunity to do it. A lot of people love the lake. They would say like, hey, that's not a lake anymore. It's basically a reservoir. It is. We've treated it like a reservoir and a sewer for God knows how long. It's kind of hard to argue with that. It's not necessarily an argument for using it as a reservoir and a sewer, but
yeah.
it's true. It's a degraded, it's a degraded treasure, and that's one of the hard choices.
Yeah. And I think the Army Corps, they're good soldiers. They are soldiers, and they do what they're told. So when they're told to treat it like a reservoir, they do. And I should have mentioned before. I mean, the reason the EA reservoir was shrunken down so much is because sugar did not want to sell anymore. We mentioned Charlie Crist's deal. Eminent domain was yanked off the table well before Senate Bill 10 got passed.
Well, you remember in my book, I tell the story of Al Gore went down to Everglades National Park in 1996, and among other things, he announced that he was about to put out a restoration plan that was going to turn 100,000 acres of sugar fields into reservoirs. And that afternoon, the phone rang in the Oval Office, where Bill Clinton was, not making this up, breaking up with his girlfriend. But he interrupted the breakup to take a 22-minute phone call from Alfonso Fanjul, who was his campaign chairman, his leading fundraiser, and was also the head of Florida Crystals. And what can I tell you? The final SERP had 50,000 acres of reservoirs from sugar fields, and obviously we haven't even done that.
Right.
So it's hard. It's it's like the kind of, when you got the kind of clout to get the president on the phone for 22 minutes while he's breaking up with his girlfriend, you got a lot of clout.
Absolutely, and it's on both sides of the aisle. So we've got a good question from Facebook asking if you can talk more about why the sugar deal unraveled under Crist.
Well, the short answer is that the economics of the industry changed, and it once again became profitable for the industry to grow sugar. They were no longer on their knees, and I guess that's half of it. The other half, and they weren't able to kind of plow ahead with the deal and get sugar bought out right away because the economy tanked so brutally, and state finances went into the toilet after the financial crash of 2008. So I would say those are the two main reasons. I mean, sugar was a willing seller, and then they became an unwilling seller. And Rick Scott has, when he was governor, he did everything in his power to make sure that they, not only that they weren't forced to go through with their original commitments, but that the state didn't even have the option to try to go through with those original commitments.
What do you think is the end game for that land around the lake? You had an interesting quote in the book about how perhaps the sugar industry would agree to sacrifice more land for restoration after it exhausted its soils, or after it lost its federal price protections, or after Castro died. Well, one of those three things has happened, and nothing's changed in terms of land use there. What do you think?
Did I say that? um,
I think that
yeah,
was a Mike quote. Yeah.
Nat Reed used to always say that everything would change after Castro, and I would always say, really?
You had perhaps at the
Yeah,
beginning of the
perhaps,
sentence.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps not. Well, that would maybe be my my response. I certainly don't see the sugar supports going away anytime soon. And look, there is some degraded land in the EAA, and I haven't followed it closely, but I'm sure there's probably a little more now than there was then. Um, but don't sell these guys. These guys are really good farmers. Um, and they're not idiots. They know that farming kind of requires soil, so they're trying to protect their soil too. And to the extent they're willing sellers, it usually means that they've hosed their soil in that particular area. But and again, and I always do try to point out when we talk about using sugarland, it's a lot. The worst possible use of that land would be to grow condos, right? Growing sugar is not nearly as damaging.
Yeah.
And
So
God forbid that should become, the next residential area, that would really
mhm.
be problematic.
And the Sugar Hill development was proposed some years ago, and I haven't seen anything about it since south of the lake. And then the other possibility is that that land could become valuable in terms of controlling water supply. I mean, we don't have privatized water the way some other places do, but do you think about that?
Feels like that sometimes, right? Well, we have these like kind of crazy, sort of water renting schemes, where we use these cattle ranches and stuff and pay absurd amounts of money to just sort of
Mhm.
let the water land on their on their ranch, which it kind of was anyway, you know. But sure, I mean that's essentially what we're talking about when we talk about reservoirs, right? Reservoir stores the most water. Then that one, the original Talisman Reservoir got turned into a flow stabilization basin or whatever they call it, which is basically a way of saying storing not quite as much water. And then, there are ways you could keep it semi-farmland and then store even less water. But all of these are ways of, ultimately it's just, all that stuff comes from the sky and it's got to go somewhere. And
Yeah.
so most of the fights in Florida about where.
So here's an interesting question from Facebook. How did the title become The Swamp? It's a river.
Well, it's a marsh, if we're going to be technical. I mean, obviously, it's sort of a double meaning. And it's the swampy politics as well as the literal swamp. Most people think of swamp, at least technically swamps are supposed to be more trees. Big cypress is a swamp. The sawgrass Everglades is more of a marsh. But really, I mean, the book is about, it's really not about, if you're going to define where is the Everglades, that's an argument that we could have all day. Essentially, I'm talking about the South Florida ecosystem and really Florida, because, the basic point you talked about how everybody cares about the Everglades in Florida. And I think it's partly because Florida used to be a swamp. And obviously, now we hear the phrase drain the swamp. Well, you don't hear it so much the last maybe 6 months, but that when people say that, it's supposed to obviously mean getting rid of a bad thing. All right. Sort of a festering mosquito infested wasteland. And that's really the way Florida was seen. And then it now we don't see it that way. It's now we see our swamps as treasures. And so while the book is about the literal transformation of this fetid, god abandoned, god forsaken swamp into a World Heritage site that and how we're trying to save it. It's also about the kind of intellectual journey that we've gone on from thinking of these places, thinking of wetlands as wastelands, to thinking of them as something that's really important to us. and I don't know, the marsh just would not have done it.
Yeah. So drain the swamp made me think of federal policy, and that made me think of Nathaniel Reed, who we both knew. He was the former Undersecretary of the Interior under Nixon. He helped write the Clean Water Act, and I can't help but think about Nat these days and wonder how he would feel about the erosions we've seen of federal environmental policy, and specifically the Clean Water Act. One example is the rollback of what waters of the US are. I'm wondering if you can comment on what role federal regulations in particular should play, the Clean Water Act and the EPA too.
There's a few things I'd love to respond to. First of all, I think we know what Nat would have thought, because he didn't die that long ago, and he was pissed. He was, in that, Brahmin, very proper way that only Nat could express his pissed offness. He was pissed off. And it's true. There has been, at the federal level, there's been an assault on wetlands. And look, I mean, I say in the book, election years are good for the Everglades, and I'm sure there's, there will be talk of throwing money at, this or that, we're gonna some invasive species project or who knows. But in general, like, you can't really put lipstick on this pig. There's been a real assault on environmental regulation, and a lot of the progress that's happened in the Everglades, water quality being the best example, have been just through saying, like, hey, there's a law. Like, the law says the water has to be clean. You got to keep it clean. The law says that you have to protect endangered species. Protect the endangered species. SERP, which was in many ways a very noble, bipartisan consensus deal that wasn't done with a gun at anybody's head, that hasn't worked as well as some of the things that really have relied on the law. And so when you're starting to take apart the law, you're taking away protections for this, this place that a lot of us love, that isn't the kind of place that would get protected if a lot of us, if there weren't law, right? It wasn't that long ago that people were talking about building airports in it. And, you still hear talk about drilling for oil in it. The Everglades is not like Yosemite National Park, where people say, like, oh, that's, ooh, ah, the Everglades is more and places, don't have that automatic protection. They have to rely on the law.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to share my screen for a second, because I've got a picture of the single runway that's out there from the original Everglades jetport, and it just tells a story that you can't quite articulate in words about Florida's follies in the environment. That would have become a major jetport that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and others worked to stop.
We can thank Nat and Joe Browder, who passed, not that long ago, who, really fought, and, Joe, it's interesting. One of the ways they defeated it, which is interesting in the terms of now that we're thinking a lot more about diversity and multicultural issues, is by making this, a real populist issue that crossed, the jetport was, they really turned it into, a couple of scam, they exposed it as a corruption issue, and they really mobilized people who loved nature, of different races and different economic backgrounds to fight against it. And that was a real example of, when people talk about the power of the people, it's hard to take on powerful interests, but sometimes you stop it, and sometimes you end up with with that instead of a massive, international airport that would be, probably, surrounded by sprawling suburbs with names like, Cypress Hill or, or I don't know,
yeah,
Panther Run.
Yeah. The federal rollbacks have been alarming in terms of removing protections from isolated wetlands. I mean, you could see in that image I just showed how many isolated wetlands are scattered across the peninsula in Florida. I guess those wouldn't be quite so isolated. They'd be connected But I
Funny
do.
that one of the heroes of my new book actually sort of stumbled into climate stuff. He used to work on wetlands things and also and including Everglades stuff. Um, but you know, he in '91, the George H.W. Bush administration just tried to tweak the rules of how wetlands are delineated in this you know, very obscure way that essentially would have kind of through bureaucratic legerdemain would have gotten rid of like maybe, you know, half of the protections for wetland, you know, of the protective wetlands in the United States. And just they ginned up this incredible outcry, real public outcry from for people who cared about this stuff. And a Republican administration backed down.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
and
we're trying to do the same.
now this stuff happens and it's not even page one, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah, well,
Oh,
it's
there's
just
so much else going on, but yeah, we've been working with some grassroots folks to try to roll back the rollbacks to the Clean Water Act for the reasons you just articulated. So outrage is important, and in that vein, we've got a question here, and in about the 6 minutes we have left, I'll get to as many of these as possible.
try not to ramble so much. So.
That's okay, me too. I have followers who publicly post flood the EAA. This is from the Indian River Keeper, Mike Connor. And he says, after all, shared adversity should be exercised. What would you tell them, his followers who say flood the EAA?
You know, people who want you know, who basically say get rid of farming there. Is that sort of a,
yeah, that just send all the water there. Don't worry about the farms.
again, I don't, you know, I think we've made it clear I'm not like a big water carrier for the sugar industry, but it's also important to remember, like, you know, the United States government, you know, it's called the EAA for a reason. That means that stands for Everglades Agricultural Area. It was set up to farm by the United States government, and it was specifically encouraged to farm sugar after, you know, Castro took over in Cuba. This was seen as important for our nation, and so people brought, you know, when they're in good faith, it's their land. Now, granted, they have a great public apparatus that is helping them farm and is keeping them dry when they want to be dry and wet when they want to be wet, and all these things that can be negotiated.
Not to mention price subsidies.
Not to mention, you know, yeah, exactly. And, you know, that keeps their extremely unhealthy product that all of us love, keeps it economically viable. Look, you know, there's gonna, like, we're not, like, it sounds nice, but we're not just gonna like flood the EAA tomorrow and put the sugar industry out of business. There's gonna have to be politics. You know, politics gets a bad name, but that's how things get done. That's how, you know, if we're going to reform police forces, it's going to happen through politics. And if we're going to, you know, deal with this frickin' virus, that's going to happen through politics. And if we're going to create a sustainable South Florida that has a, you know, room for the sugar industry and 8 million people and also a viable Everglades, that's going to require some politics too.
Political will. The next question is in that vein. What are the first one or two things needed to move Florida towards electing more environmentally savvy politicians?
Well, that's a great question. The first thing I always point out is that Florida's voters are very green. You know, my best example of that I tell in the book is that in 1994, Jeb Bush was seen as like an almost shoo-in to be like a future Republican president, because he was running for governor in 1994, which turned out to be an overwhelmingly Republican year. He was this very serious, extremely conservative guy, who seemed to represent this new wave of contract with America kind of Republicans. But he was like the only Republican who lost that year. And one of the reasons was because he ran around saying like that basically he was running against radical enviros who were, you know, were hamstringing business, and that he was going to stop the madness. And meanwhile, his like kind of, you know, brother, who was always seen as this kind of heavy drinker and not really interested in politics, he won in Texas, and every other Republican won, and, you know, the rest is history. But Jeb ran again in '98. The first thing he did after he lost was he joined the Audubon Society, and he started going to all their Everglades restoration meetings. And he ran in '98 as a Republican environmentalist and won in a landslide, which is a long-winded way of saying that there is a constituency for environmentalism in Florida. The problem, I think, is that it's become too easy. And here, Friends of the Everglades is not the worst offender, but environmental groups have made it pretty easy to run as an environmentalist in Florida. It's sort of like all you have to do is say, I'm for the Everglades. We need more money for the Everglades. And that's how, nobody's ox end up getting gore, as I said earlier, and progress doesn't really seem to happen. We haven't really forced politicians to make hard choices. And you mentioned Rick Scott. He paid no price.
Right.
He paid no price. So I think there has to be a little bit more distinguishing between people who say they're good for the Everglades and people who actually do stuff.
I think that's very well put, especially in this election year. And we do tend to be pretty picky about who we put our seal of approval on. I think that stems back to Marjorie's pig-headed ways, as she called them. In the couple minutes we have left, I was just hoping you'd share with us a favorite Marjorie story from the book. She's a bit of a mythological figure in Florida environmental circles. She's our founder. And what did you glean from her when you wrote The Swamp? And I know she wasn't alive then.
Gosh, yeah, it's funny. I mentioned to you that one of my close friends at the Washington Post actually interviewed her when she was like 103, and she she knocked on the door, and Marjorie answered the door and answered in completely nude. She was quite a character. One thing, and this is it's just jumping to my mind, but that it's, certainly probably the wrong thing to talk about at a Friends of the Everglades gig. But I've really grown to admire Marjorie more and more with time. One thing that comes across, I think, in the book, and I wasn't trying to be mean about it. I think it's certainly, I admire her, and that comes through in the book. But she was wrong about a lot. She got a lot wrong. But she was one example that she talks about in her autobiography is she thought that the whole breeding program for panthers was a terrible idea. But she says in her autobiography, like, whoa, I was wrong about that. It ended up saving the panther. She was, when the first Central and South Florida water project came out, the project that essentially drained half the Everglades and is responsible for a lot of the problems we had. She thought it was a wonderful thing. She said, finally, a plan for the Everglades. And then later she said, boy, did I get that wrong. She had this incredible intellectual honesty and, she was right about a lot of things too, about the importance of the Everglades. She was a feminist pioneer, racial equality pioneer. And she really called it like she saw it. And then if she saw it differently later, she said that too. And so I think in this kind of, she never fit into neat boxes, the kind of, we live in such a shirts and skins partisan era. She held everybody, she put everybody's feet to the fire. And she didn't pull punches, but then when she changed her mind, she said so. So I think, I think for all of us, that's kind of a cool example.
It is. I think there's no better way to wrap this up than by dwelling on intellectual honesty. That's a great point for these times. Yeah. We'll seize on that. And I cannot thank you enough for sharing your thoughts about your book, about what's happened in the Everglades since then, and just the times we're living in. It's much appreciated.
Well, we'll do it in person when if we ever solve this particular problem.
I hope so. We'll definitely have you back. Thanks, Mike. Take care.
Thank you.